So, in the material from Bruce Hoffman that I actually read, we're specifically addressing this question of WMD, weapons of mass destruction terrorism, or the initials that we're going to use here are CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. CBRN terrorism. And, and really the question we're asking ourselves is how likely is this? Is this going to be the next sort of thing that we should be worried about? And so we have to start with sort of understanding this in some historical perspective. The historical record of terrorism suggests that the likelihood of CBRN terrorism is incredibly low. However, this has changed in recent years. It has changed in recognition that the dominant motivating ideologies for many groups today makes the use of these weapons more plausible, and that we do in fact have evidence of groups with demonstrated willingness to try to develop and use these weapons if they can get their hands on them. And that means we should no longer consider this possibility out of the question. How did we understand this before? And be clear, right? The tipping point is 9/11, as with so many things about the way that Americans think about terrorism. So, what was our prior understanding? Why did we assume this was going to be unlikely? Well, as we've talked about earlier and repeatedly throughout the semester, we understand that terrorists were frankly quite careful to exercise limited amounts of violence. In other words, they were trying very hard for the most part to avoid extreme levels of violence out of a recognition that this could potentially completely alienate both the audience they claim to represent, the people they say they're fighting for, and the audience they sought to persuade. And this is back to that phrase we dealt with at the very beginning of the semester, that famous quote from Brian Jenkins that terrorists want a lot of people watching and listening and not a lot of people dead. There was also, of course, the fear of triggering a severe government reprisal that would lead to the utter destruction of a terrorist organization and its supporters. And so groups were willing to impose self-restraint in terms of the amount of violence they were willing to inflict. Something else that Hoffman points out is that terrorist groups historically have been generally operationally conservative. That means they employed a limited tactical repertoire directed against a narrow set of targets. When they innovated, that innovation tended to be an expansion in the range of what were considered legitimate targets, which we've talked about before. But even there, they're still constrained by what their ideology defines those legitimate targets to be. Where we saw innovation in methods, it was primarily to improve the tried and true things they were already doing. Manufacture of explosives, how to hide them, how to detonate them, timers, remote detonations. Strapping them to a human body is an innovation in the use of a tried and true method, which is simply bombing. So not a lot of innovation there either. And it's true that some groups up through the mid-1990s had toyed with the idea of chemical or biological attacks. It was really only until we get to the mid-1990s when we saw evidence of very limited examples of such plots actually moving forward. I think Hoffman identifies 3 that were actually put into place. And one of them involved contaminating a salad bar, at like the local Applebee's. It was that kind of, yeah, go figure. So why? Why did groups who knew about these weapons, were aware of their existence, why weren't they interested in pursuing them? Well, one of the arguments is first is fear, right? Terrorists, like most people, appeared to be fearful of these powerful contaminants and toxins that they didn't know much about, that they weren't certain how to make, they didn't really know how to handle safely, nor how to deploy effectively. Who wants to mess with stuff you don't understand? But there was also this sort of rationality argument, and that is it was hard to conceive of goals or objectives that using these kind of weapons could help groups achieve that they couldn't do with less indiscriminate forms of attacks. Especially if what your goal is to gain political power or a share of power or something concrete like that. It's tough to bargain your way into the political process by setting off a chemical weapon in the capital city of your adversary. They're unlikely to want to bring you to the bargaining table under those kinds of circumstances. 9/11, of course, changes this conventional wisdom, and it does so in a couple ways. Documents are captured in Afghanistan from Al Qaeda facilities that demonstrate that AQ had advanced research and development programs and had very clear intent to want to acquire these weapons and these capabilities. 9/11 also immediately changed the understanding about whether or not terrorists were interested in generating mass levels of casualties. So, we learned that AQ was actively seeking to develop these weapons or acquire them in other ways, and we realized that there are ideologies out there, in particular these religious motivations that we've talked about before, that put mass casualties on the table in ways that we didn't assume they were on the table before. That said, there are still huge technical hurdles and challenges to being able to do this stuff. Intent and willingness are not necessarily matched by expertise and the capabilities required to make or effectively use these weapons. Just because you're interested doesn't mean that you can experiment with these substances and devices. Doesn't mean that you can master the procedures necessary to execute an attack. Gaining access to the materials you need, especially radioactive materials, remains a huge burden, but it's not the only one. You also have to figure out how to deliver toxins on target in sufficient quantities to kill in the same fashion as explosives. In other words, if you're trying to make a bigger bang than traditional explosives, you got to figure out how to actually do that in a way that's going to be plausible. One of the things that we know is that even conventional militaries struggled with the use of these kinds of weapons. It took a long time for the armies of World War I to figure out how to use chemical weapons on the battlefield, and then the reality is they were far less lethal than shells and machine gun bullets. The Japanese experiments with biological warfare in China in the early years of World War II, a similar example. And even the repeated failures of OHM, probably the terrorist organization before Al Qaeda that was most interested in developing these weapons, their repeated failures are instructive. They had repeatedly tried to develop biological weapons and failed. They had repeatedly attempted to successfully deploy chemical weapons. In fact, even their notorious Tokyo subway attack really represents more of a failure than of a success. 12 people die in that attack. What Hoffman points out is that if OHM had simply planted conventional bombs on those subway cars, they would have killed far more people through the blast damage, fire, and smoke inhalation than the 12 who died from exposure to sarin. The reported 5,000 casualties, additional 5,000 casualties connected to the OHM attack, many of those have to do with shock and post-traumatic stress and other sort of psychological injuries as opposed to physical injuries. So the bottom line with that Tokyo attack is OHM would have been better off with a backpack bomb, good old-fashioned high explosives, than trying to set off some, miracle chemical weapon. Despite these constraints, it is clear that terrorist organizations are fully aware of the powerful psychological impact, the enhanced fear and intimidation that a CBRN attack would generate, even if it fails to kill or injure large numbers. Terrorists also seem fully aware of how such an attack would undermine public trust and confidence in the ability of governments to prevent such an attack and to keep their citizens safe. So what's the bottom line? The currently dominant religious motivation behind so much terrorism today puts these methods on the table despite the technical hurdles. By the same token, access to the materials you would need to produce these weapons has frankly become easier since the end of the Cold War as international control regimes have slackened. And domestically, the highly toxic radioactive components you would need for a dirty bomb can be readily acquired. You don't have to go overseas. And easily paired with a powerful conventional explosive, not just destroying the primary target, but also contaminating a wide area around it. So, dirty bombs, right? These are, if it's going to happen, this is what most people expect is going to be. If you get a chance, for example, if we were meeting in class, we would have watched the HBO film called Dirty War, which is exactly about the preparation of, the deployment of, the detonation of a dirty bomb. In this case, it's in central London, and then the challenge of dealing with it in the immediate aftermath. If you get a chance to watch it, I'm going to encourage you to do so. What's Hoffman's conclusion? He says because of the extreme consequences that could result from an attack involving a nuclear bomb or radiological material, or a chemical weapon or biological agent, even the remotest likelihood of such a possibility cannot be completely dismissed as non existent. Highly unlikely, but we can't dismiss it.